My father handed me an envelope at my own wedding reception, in front of 200 guests, smiled for the cameras, and walked away before I even opened it. Inside was a parking ticket. My parking ticket. From 11 years ago, the summer I turned 16, back when I'd borrowed his car and gotten a citation outside the community pool. He'd paid it that day. He'd never let me forget it. Taped to the ticket was a sticky note in his handwriting. 3 words, "Figure your life out." That was my wedding gift. Not a check, not a card. A decade-old piece of paper meant to remind 200 people, including my new in-laws, that I was still the disappointment he'd always said I was. I smiled. I thanked him. I put the envelope in my clutch and finished my first dance. What my father didn't know, what nobody at that reception knew except my new husband and me, was that the man sitting at table 14, the old friend from the club my father had personally invited and spent 20 minutes bragging to, was about to become the person who fired him. And he was going to do it that night, at my wedding, the moment he found out what my father had just done. But we'll get to that. Let me back up, because you need to understand exactly how long this had been building, and exactly how badly my father miscalculated who was in that room. My name doesn't matter for this story, so I'll just tell you what you need to know. I'm 31. I run a logistics consulting firm I built from nothing, starting at 24, out of a spare bedroom, with a laptop and a client list of exactly one company that agreed to give me a chance, because everyone else turned me down. My father is named Richard. He's 62. For the last 19 years, he has worked as a regional operations director for a mid-sized freight and shipping company called Continental Crestline Logistics. It's a solid, respectable, unglamorous job. He's proud of it. He should be proud of it. What he is not proud of, and has never once in his life been proud of, is me. Growing up, there was a very clear hierarchy in our house. My younger brother Evan played baseball, and baseball was a religion. Every dinner was about batting averages and scholarship offers and which college scout had shown up to which game. I did not play baseball. I liked numbers. I liked systems. I liked figuring out how 10 moving pieces could become 9 moving pieces and still get the same job done faster. Nobody in my family understood that as a skill. They understood it as me being the quiet one who hadn't found her thing yet. I found my thing. I just found it in an industry my father happened to work in, doing something he considered beneath real business. Consulting, he called it once, doing air quotes with his fingers at a barbecue, which means you tell people things they already know and charge them for it. That was 4 years ago. At the time, my company had 3 employees and I was one of them. Here's the detail I need you to remember, because it matters later. My father has spent 19 years at Continental Crestline under a man named Walter Higgins. Walter is the regional vice president. Walter is, by every account my father has ever given at every family dinner for the last decade, a legend, the smartest guy I've ever worked for, and, this is the part that matters, someone my father has been trying to get closer to socially for years. Golf outings, fundraiser dinners. The country club my parents joined specifically, my mother once let slip, because Walter was a member. My father wanted to be Walter's guy. He wanted it badly enough that when I got engaged, and he found out my fiancé's family had connections in the shipping industry, my father's first question wasn't about my fiancé. It was whether Walter might be interested in coming to the wedding, just to see the kind of people we run with. I said, sure. Invite him. I had no idea, at the time, how much that single invitation was going to matter. I want to show you 3 moments, spread across about 6 years, because a wedding gift like a parking ticket doesn't come out of nowhere. It's the final punctuation mark on a much longer sentence. Moment 1. I was 25. I'd just landed my first 6-figure contract. A logistics audit for a regional grocery chain that took me 4 months of unpaid proposal work to win. I called my dad because I wanted, more than anything, for him to be proud of me. He listened for about 90 seconds. Then he said, That's great, sweetheart. You know Evan just got asked to interview for a coaching position at the university, right? Division 2, but still. I hadn't asked about Evan. I hadn't mentioned Evan. He redirected a conversation about my biggest professional win of my life to my brother's job interview within a minute and a half, and he didn't seem to notice he'd done it. Moment 2. I was 28. I bought my first house, paid for entirely with money I'd earned. No loans from anyone. A 3-bedroom place 40 minutes outside the city. I invited my parents over for the housewarming. My father walked through every room, said almost nothing, and then, standing in my kitchen, asked how much I'd actually put down, in a tone that made it clear he assumed either I was lying about paying for it myself, or I'd made some financially reckless decision he needed to audit. When I told him the number, he didn't say congratulations. He said, "Well, I hope you know what you're doing." Then he asked if Evan had seen the house yet, because Evan might have some opinions on the resale value, despite my brother having never bought or sold a property in his life. Moment 3. And this is the one that really tells you everything. 2 years ago, my company hit 7 figures in annual revenue for the first time. I found out on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting alone in my office, and the first thing I did, before I even told my now husband, was call my father. Old habits. I still, even at 29 years old, wanted his approval more than I wanted almost anything else, he said, and I remember this word for word because I've replayed it so many times it's carved into me. Must be nice. Some of us had real jobs where you actually build something. I run a company. I employ 11 people now. I have built something, brick by brick, for 6 years, with no help from him, no loans from him, no introductions from him. But in his mind, because it wasn't baseball, and because it wasn't the kind of company Continental Crestline would ever hire, wait, actually, that's not true either. I'll get to that. The point is, by the time my wedding rolled around, I had spent over a decade collecting evidence that no accomplishment, no matter how large, would ever be enough. So when the parking ticket showed up in that envelope, some small, exhausted part of me wasn't even surprised. It was almost a relief. Finally, undeniable, physical proof, in his own handwriting, of something I'd known for years, but could never quite say out loud without someone telling me I was too sensitive or reading into it. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and here's the piece my father genuinely, catastrophically, did not know. 18 months before the wedding, my consulting firm won a contract that changed everything for us. A national retail distribution company was overhauling its regional freight partnerships, and they brought me in to audit and restructure vendor relationships across 4 states. It was, by a wide margin, the biggest contract my company had ever landed, and it required me to spend 3 months deep in the operational weeds of every major freight and logistics provider in the region, including Continental Crestline. I want to be clear, I never mentioned this to my father, not because it was some elaborate secret plan. At the time, it genuinely didn't occur to me that it mattered. My work is confidential by nature. I don't discuss client engagements with family, and my father has never once asked a single detailed question about what my company actually does, so the opportunity to tell him simply never came up. He knew I did consulting. He did not know which companies. He'd never asked. During that audit, I spent 4 separate meetings across 2 months, sitting across a conference table from a sharp, blunt, 60-something regional vice president named Walter Higgins. I recognized the name instantly. I said nothing. Professional confidentiality, plus, if I'm honest, a small, curious part of me wanted to see what my father's legend was actually like, without the filter of my father's hero worship distorting him. Walter turned out to be exactly what you'd want in a business partner, and almost nothing like what my father had described. He was demanding, precise, and completely uninterested in office politics or golf course flattery. In our second meeting, he told me flatly that half his division's inefficiencies traced back to a management culture that rewarded loyalty and tenure over actual results, his words, and that he was tired of it. In our fourth and final meeting, wrapping up the audit, Walter asked me a question that had nothing to do with the contract. He asked if I'd be interested in staying on in an advisory capacity for the region, specifically to help him identify which management-level personnel were adding value and which were, in his words, coasting on 20 years of nobody checking their numbers. I said I'd think about it. I did not, at that point, connect any of this to my father because, and this is important, I still didn't know exactly where in the org chart my father sat relative to what Walter was describing. Continental Crestline is a large regional operation. My father managed one district. Walter oversaw the entire region. It's entirely possible to work at the same company for years and never have your paths cross in any meaningful data, until I actually did the audit work. 3 weeks before my wedding, finishing the final phase of the advisory engagement, I pulled the performance data for every district manager in the region, going back 5 years, as part of a broader efficiency report Walter had asked me to compile. My father's district had the second worst on-time delivery rate in the entire region. His team's cost overruns were the highest of any district his size, and in a company-wide anonymous employee satisfaction survey I was given access to for the audit, his direct reports rated him the lowest of any manager in the region on the categories of recognition of others' contributions and supports employee growth. I sat with that for a long time, not because I was surprised by the second part, because of the first part. My father, the man who spent 19 years telling our family that Evan's baseball statistics were the most important numbers in the world, the man who couldn't remember to ask about my 7-figure year, was, by every metric that actually mattered to his own company, underperforming badly. And Walter, the man he idolized, was 2 board meetings away from recommending a restructuring that would very likely eliminate my father's position entirely. I finished the report. I submitted it to Walter exactly as the data showed it, with no names softened and no numbers adjusted, because that's the job, and because, I'll admit this honestly, some part of me had stopped feeling obligated to protect a man who'd never once protected my feelings. Then my wedding happened. My father arrived at the venue 3 hours early, in a rented tux, glad-handing every guest who'd RSVP'd from the club, working the room like it was his event. When Walter walked in, and Walter came alone, no +1, which should have told my father something about how personal this was to him versus how personal my father imagined it to be, my father intercepted him at the door like he'd been waiting there the whole time. I watched from across the room as my father steered Walter toward the open bar, one hand on his shoulder, laughing too loud at something, clearly performing the version of himself he'd been performing at that country club for a decade. Walter shook his hand politely. Walter's eyes found me over my father's shoulder. He gave me a small, professional nod, nothing more. He didn't know, and I hadn't told him, that Richard was my father. My audit report had used first initials and district codes, not full names, per Walter's own request for the sensitive first draft. The connection hadn't been made yet, not by Walter. Not by anyone in that room except me and my husband. The reception moved through its normal beats: toasts, dinner, the father-daughter dance, which my father performed flawlessly, smiling for every photo, playing the role of proud father so convincingly that 3 separate guests told me afterward how close we clearly were. Then came the gifts. My father stood up at the microphone. He'd asked for the microphone. Nobody offered it to him, and said he wanted to give his gift, the old-fashioned way, in front of everyone, the way his own father used to do it. He handed me the envelope. I opened it in front of 200 people, because I had no reason not to, no warning of what was inside. I want you to sit in that moment with me for a second, because I think about it a lot. The room went quiet, the way rooms do when they sense something's wrong, before they know what it is. I pulled out a parking ticket, 11 years old, faded at the folds from being kept in a drawer or a filing cabinet for over a decade specifically for this purpose. And the note. 3 words. Figure your life out. My new mother-in-law's face did something I will never forget. My husband's jaw tightened. And at table 14, close enough to see but not quite close enough to hear the words clearly, Walter Higgins watched my father hand his daughter a decade-old traffic citation as a wedding gift and sit back down like he'd just given a toast. Here's what happened next, and I need to walk through it slowly because the timing is the entire story. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I folded the ticket back into the envelope, smiled the practiced smile I'd been using around my father since I was about 14 years old, and said, "Thanks, Dad," loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, quiet enough not to escalate anything. But my husband, who by that point had heard every version of every story I've just told you, multiple times, over years, did something I hadn't planned and didn't ask him to do. He walked over to table 14. He introduced himself to Walter Higgins as my husband. And in the course of normal small talk, thanking Walter for coming, he mentioned, entirely casually, that I ran a consulting firm and had actually done some regional freight work recently. Walter's expression changed. He asked the name of the firm. My husband told him. Walter looked across the room at me. Then he looked at my father, still glowing from his big microphone moment, still accepting handshakes and compliments on his sentimental gift, from relatives who hadn't seen what was actually inside the envelope. Then Walter did the math. He knew my firm. He knew the audit. He knew the district codes in that report, because he'd requested the anonymized first draft specifically and had since seen the full unmasked version with names 2 weeks before the wedding as part of the final restructuring recommendation. He knew exactly which district manager had the second worst on-time rate in the region, the highest cost overruns, and the lowest scores on supporting his team. He knew, in other words, exactly who Richard was, professionally, on paper, in numbers that didn't care about golf outings or country club dues, or which stories got told at Sunday dinner. Walter walked over to my father. I couldn't hear the first part of the conversation from where I was standing, but I could see it. I could see my father's posture change, the easy, expansive confidence draining out of him in real time, replaced by the smaller, tighter posture I recognized from every time in my childhood he'd been caught in something he couldn't talk his way out of. I saw Walter gesture, once, toward me. I saw my father's face go pale. My new sister-in-law, standing near me, leaned over and whispered, "Is that your dad's boss? He looks like he's about to be sick." He should have. I want to tell you exactly what Walter said, because I got the full account from my husband, who was standing close enough to hear all of it, and later, in more detail, from Walter himself, at a follow-up meeting that had nothing to do with my wedding, and everything to do with the fact that my professional relationship with him didn't end that night. Walter didn't yell. That's not who he is, and honestly, it made the whole thing land harder. He said, flatly, "Richard, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." My father said, "Sure, of course, anything." Walter asked if he knew what his daughter's company did. My father, still not understanding what was happening, said something about consulting, some kind of logistics thing, dismissively, the same tone he'd used at that barbecue years earlier. Walter told him that his daughter's firm had just completed the regional audit that was going to determine the outcome of the district restructuring meeting scheduled for the following month. That she'd handled his data with more precision and more integrity than half the internal reports his own department had produced in years. That he had, independently, before ever knowing the two of them were related, already begun drafting a recommendation to bring her on in an ongoing advisory capacity because of the quality of that work. And then Walter said the part that I think, honestly, is the actual point of this entire story, more than any parking ticket or any envelope. He said, "I've known you 19 years, Richard. I've heard you talk about your kids 100 times at that club. I don't think I've ever once heard you mention what she does for a living. I had no idea until 10 minutes ago that the woman who just handed me the most useful report my office has gotten in 5 years was your daughter. You should have led with that instead of a parking ticket." My father didn't have an answer. What answer was there? Walter didn't fire him on the spot, dramatically, in front of 200 wedding guests. That's not how businesses actually work, and I want to be honest with you, rather than give you a movie ending that isn't true. What he did do was tell my father, quietly, that given what he'd just learned about both his numbers and his character, the conversation they'd need to have wouldn't wait until after the honeymoon season. My father's restructuring meeting, originally scheduled to be a routine annual review, was moved up. 3 weeks later, his district was folded into a neighboring one, and his role was eliminated. He was offered a lesser position at a satellite office 90 minutes further from home. He took early retirement instead. I'm not going to pretend I felt only satisfaction when I heard the outcome, because that wouldn't be honest, and honesty is the only reason any of this is worth telling. For about a week after the wedding, I felt something closer to grief than victory. Not because my father lost his job. He did that to himself, over 19 years of decisions that had nothing to do with me, but because the entire event crystallized something I'd spent my whole adult life trying not to fully accept. My father was never going to see me clearly. Not because he lacked the information. I'd told him, repeatedly, in numbers and milestones and phone calls he redirected within 90 seconds. He had the information. He simply never valued it enough to hold on to it. The parking ticket wasn't really about a parking ticket. It was about a man who'd built his entire identity around being the kind of father whose kids performed, publicly, in ways he understood. A batting average, a scholarship, something he could brag about at a bar. And when his daughter succeeded in a language he'd never bothered to learn, he didn't see success. He saw something he couldn't categorize, and instead of asking a single question about it, he handed her 11-year-old proof that he'd stopped paying attention a long time ago. My mother called me 2 days after the wedding. She didn't apologize on his behalf. She never really has. That's its own story. But she did say something I think about often. She said, "He didn't know, honey. If he'd known what you actually did, he never would have," and I cut her off. Gently, because I needed her to understand something. He didn't know because he never asked. Not knowing isn't an accident when it's the result of a decade of choosing not to look. My father and I still speak. It's not estranged, dramatic silence. It's smaller than that, and honestly sadder. Family gatherings are shorter now. Conversations are politer and thinner. He's never mentioned the wedding gift again. Not once, not even obliquely. I think, in his mind, if it's never discussed, it never fully happened. But something did change, and this is the part that actually matters. 6 weeks after the wedding, Walter Higgins formally brought my firm on as an ongoing regional advisory partner, a contract worth more than my entire first 2 years of revenue combined. Not because of who my father was, because of the work. Because for once, in a room that had nothing to do with my family, someone looked at what I'd built and simply, plainly, judged it on its own merit. That's the gift my father never gave me. Somebody else did, entirely by accident, the same night my father tried, one more time, to make me feel small. I've thought a lot about why this story stayed with me the way it did, beyond the obvious satisfaction of watching accountability finally land on someone who'd avoided it for decades. I think it's because of how ordinary the cruelty was. Nobody in my family ever screamed at me. Nobody ever said, out loud, "We love your brother more." It was quieter than that, and quieter cruelty is somehow harder to point to, harder to justify being hurt by, because anyone looking from the outside can always say, "But it was just a parking ticket. Why are you so upset?" The wound wasn't the ticket. The wound was 11 years of 100 small moments just like it. And the ticket was simply the one that finally happened in front of witnesses who couldn't rationalize it away. If you've ever had a parent, a sibling, a family member who consistently, quietly, made you feel like your version of success didn't count because it wasn't the version they understood, I think you already knew, before I got to the ending, exactly how this story was going to feel in your chest. That recognition, more than the plot itself, is what this is really about. And I think there's something worth sitting with in how the reversal actually happened. I didn't plan it. I didn't orchestrate some elaborate scheme to expose my father at my own wedding. I simply kept doing my work, honestly and well, in a world my father had never bothered to understand, and the truth found its own way into the room. Sometimes the most satisfying justice isn't the kind you build, it's the kind that was already there, waiting, because you never stopped showing up for yourself even when nobody else did. If you've made it this far, I'd genuinely like to know, did you have a moment like this in your own family? A single instant where something quiet finally became impossible to ignore? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and honestly, some of the best stories on this channel have come from things people shared down there. If this one hit home, there's more where it came from. I post new stories like this every few days, and if you don't want to miss the next one, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.